The time is August 1986, where one of the strangest, boldest swings in movie history was released. This was a big budget gamble from George Lucas, riding high after the success of Star Wars, and believe it or not, one of the very first attempts to bring a Marvel comic character to the big screen. Long before the MCU was even a dream, we get a sarcastic, cigar-smoking duck from another world, where Howard, an evolved duck from another dimension, crash lands on Earth and teams up with a struggling rock singer and a below-par scientist to stop the dark overlords from invading the planet. When it hit theaters, audiences didn't quite know what to do with it, critics tore it apart, it flopped hard at the box office and quickly became infamous. But over the years, it's found a second life as a cult classic. Was it misunderstood then by critics and audiences? We talk about it because this week we cover the 1986 film, Howard the Duck.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony.
You know, I'm going to treat this show as my cinematic confession booth, and I'm just going to say it. There was never a minute from my first viewing from a kid to now that I ever disliked Howard the Duck. This is one of the guilty pleasures where I can recognize the cheekiness to it. I can recognize the villain getting different superpowers wherever it's convenient for the situation. I can even recognize the what the fuck moments, but damn, from the fun, cheesy performances, the soundtrack, and I think you know me well enough, I love a good show-stopping ending. This movie is up my alley. I love Howard the Duck. I'm saying it now, and I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I like it too, but I like it the way I like Little Caesar's pizza. It's not like I crave it, and it's not like I'm going to go get it on my own, but if it's there, I'm eating it, and I'll probably eat more of it than I should. And that's how I am with Howard the Duck. I've had that Blu-ray Steelbook for 7-8 years it's been out. It's just a movie that I can't imagine not being in my collection, but I only ever watch it when someone hasn't seen it, when someone wants to watch it, or in this case, where we're doing a podcast episode for it. You know me, I love what I call tchotchke movies. This is a tchotchke movie. This is a movie that's like a conversation piece of how the hell did this movie get made? Why did it get made? But I'm glad it exists. And because we're both children of the 80s, this was that taboo movie that came out where parents were like, is this for grown-ups? Is this for kids? Who exactly is the audience for this movie? The fact that it had George Lucas attached to it, we'll get into that later. But also, we've already discussed Willard Huck movies on this podcast. We talked about Radioland Murders, which he and Gloria Katz's wife wrote. Mel Stewart directed. They wrote and produced this. He directed this. They also directed one of my favorite horror movies of all time, Messiah of Evil. The talent behind this movie, especially the special effects, which we'll get into later, I think is undeniable. And so it is one of those movies where it's okay, on paper, I get why critics and maybe most audience members and the media and the industry kind of hated this movie, but the cult audience it has is undeniable, and the mark that it's left on, let's say, intellectual properties is undeniable. And I know he's a controversial figure now, but Jeffrey Jones might be one of the best cinematic villains of the 80s in this movie. So I think all in all, man, there's just way too much good in this movie for a fan, but I do understand why critics were obligated to tear it apart.
And I also want to throw it in there, the cynical piece of it, that expectations of George Lucas at this time really did have a high standard when it comes to creativity, special effects, the opera storytelling, if you will. So I think having a space duck come down to earth, really a lot of people weren't ready for. But you have all the ingredients here for pure entertainment. You have a fantastic score by John Barry that is literally carries this story. And even after the credits roll, you hear the Howard the Duck theme roll in your head afterwards. So the soundtrack is fantastic. You have the performances, again, the dialogue is cheeky, it's situational, but the performances carry it. We want to follow these characters because at least the chemistry is there, even though we have some predictable moments, we have some unbelievable moments, especially as we go towards the climax. But everything, when it comes to the ingredients of making a fun spectacle, works. And you can tell this was more targeted for kids. If I were to critique it, I would say, again, we're going to talk about it, but lose the duck boobs in the first act. That sets the expectation. And you might have just pure entertainment for kids and families that really would go along with this. But we start with the first act that really does have some sexual themes to it. And then it just kind of forgets itself until we get to kind of the awkward Leah Thompson, Howard the Duck sex scene almost. So I think if you lose all that, this would have been something audiences would have related to a little bit. They would have engaged with, but it was so all over the place on what kind of movie this is. It left a question mark in the 80s of who this movie was meant for.
Yeah, I agree. And here's the thing too, is like no one was really making comic book movies, especially Marvel movies in the 80s, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all those things, they were owned or licensed by Canon Pictures, even though those movies never got made. And Canon Pictures, as everyone knows, was kind of like the B movie grindhouse of the 80s. This could have, should have fallen into that category. However, George Lucas, and again, Lucas is high on his own supply at this point in the 80s, right? He's already knocked it out of the park with the Indiana Jones movies, with the Star Wars movies, and he's really getting into like the technical proficiencies. You've got young Sherlock Holmes, essentially groundbreaking CGI technology, Industrial Light and Magic doing so much great work with, let's say, the Star Trek picture, the first one, uh, really focusing on special effects, and the special effects in this movie are amazing, especially in the last act. The creature, the Overlord, anything that has to do with like the wormhole, all the space stuff, it's great. I think that is where the challenge was of where this movie needs to find its audience, because with each movie that Lucas was putting out, the maturity level was getting higher and higher, right? Like Temple of Doom takes a huge leap in terms of violence and content than Raiders of the Lost Ark. And even if you look at all three Star Wars movies, Return of the Jedi has darker themes than the other two. Maybe Empire Strikes Back is darker in tone, but there's more grisly ideas placed in the third one. The fact that, the Ewoks are, I'm not gonna say cannibalistic, but they eat people, right? Where did Leia's dress come from? I assume it came from a sacrifice of a human female earlier in history. But that being said, I really think that Lucas was trying to say, I don't want to be a kid's filmmaker anymore. Let's make something that's for both audiences and push the envelope. And that is where we get this idea of sexuality in a comic book movie about a talking duck, vulgarity, alcoholism, cigar smoking, misogyny. There's a lot of mature content in this movie, but I feel like it's warranted because that was the whole point. Howard the Duck isn't necessarily a role model, and I don't think that the critics' response to that character is correct when we get there. I think that this is just a movie about a curmudgeon-y character that's taken from his world, put into another, and allowed to be more curmudgeon-y, and then eventually become a hero based out of that. In a sense, Howard is an anti-hero. And I think that's lost in the marketing. It's lost in the translation, the fact that we're watching a duck on screen. And I just don't think that audiences and critics were ready for that kind of blurring of the lines of good taste and box office appeal.
I wouldn't call it sexuality. It's more bestiality, but that's more in the like second act. But I think my main issue with it, if I were to be fair with this movie and look at kind of the faults with it. I think Howard didn't go far enough.
I
I think
agree.
he was a safe character. I think with when it comes to Ed Hale, he plays it a little too safe when it comes to his body language, and that could be with the special effects. But I think the voice and the body language between Howard doesn't go far enough to it. And I think what we are missing is this duck in a new world that should have a little bit of fear, should have a little bit of emotion, should have a little bit of attitude to match his persona. It should have leaned a little bit more to the adult piece of it, but they tried to make it too safe to appease all audiences. So it needs to find its footing on what it wants to do. And if we're going to lean into the relationship with Thompson and Howard, then we should go all in with this. We should have some swear words being dropped to signify emotion because they here it would be justified. So I think it I hate to say it because Howard is the driver of this movie. As a kid, I loved Howard because he was innocent enough where it didn't really tip the hat to full adult movie. But as an adult, I'm screaming, give me more. Give me more of the sarcastic humor. Give me more dirty jokes. And I know that we introduced Howard later in the MCU that kind of dipped its toes into that, but at the same time, it's still safe. So this is a character that really should focus on just kind of the old Frank Sinatra noir kind of feel. And we never really master the character. It's just really throwing darts at the board, hoping that somebody connects with this character. But holistically, what works is going to be the chemistry of the ensemble. The cast makes this work. Everybody has their moments of being memorable. And I think even with Howard's fault, the cast really does support the movie when it comes to driving it. We have the adventure, we have the thrills, we have the horror, and we have the comedy. Everybody plays their part in this movie to really give that entertainment value here, even with Howard's faults.
Yeah, well, I mean, like the MVP actors in this movie for sure are Leah Thompson and Tim Robbins. I feel like, Tim Robbins making like an early appearance in a movie that this could have been like the death nail in his career, right? He came out all right. But, he really plays that character exactly the way we would expect him to. Leah Thompson definitely has her Back to the Future cred that doesn't really affect her career. And then Jeffrey Jones, of course, playing a villain character and being a little bit more sinister. So here was the thing that's interesting about this is that the original concept for this is that it was supposed to be an animated movie. And there's lots of back and forth on like why they went live action. The biggest part of it is that it was actually cheaper to do live action than it was to do it as an animated film. And the production was so rushed towards the end where they had all these plans of what they wanted to do, but then did not have the financing that they needed. Therefore, the Howard costume is questionable from scene to scene. In close-ups, the animatronics is, pretty impressive. The eyeballs move and stuff like that's expression. But when you cut to like a wide or a master shot, it's obviously a very static duck face of this character just running around. You kind of have to be really looking for it to see it, but it's there. Also, the idea that there isn't really a complete script here, right? Like they are just kind of playing jazz. That's why it does feel like three different movies. But this is where I'm forgiving of it. And I feel you might be the same way too. The amount of detail and time they spent into making the world of Howard the Duck so authentic. The fact that like the first 5-minute segment on his planet, the amount of marketing in the movie, we've got, the Raiders of the Lost Ark posters, but it's duck, all the things that are like duck themed, like the Mallard credit card instead of MasterCard, Rolling Egg magazine. Like they made these things. This wasn't CG. Like someone actually produced all of this material for a 5-minute scene. And I thought that was brilliant because it really does show the old fashioned way of filmmaking and production of props. The whole movie is like that. The art direction is fantastic. So technically and artistically, the movie is phenomenal. And then the script kind of is weakened by it. That's where it's hard for a critic because the movie can look amazing and they're complimentary of what the movie looks like for sure. But it doesn't feel like a complete package. but we're forgiving of that. Again, it's something that midnight movies and cult favorites are made of. I would say, to go on your point of, if I wanted this movie to go harder, which I would love for this to be an R-rated movie, but it would have a different cult following if it did, right? It would have a more mature, almost kind of skeezy, let's say the audience that loves Shakes the Clown would love an R-rated Howard the Duck, where this one still feels like it has a little bit of family kid movie cred to it, so it doesn't feel as dangerous as a film to watch for younger generations, where if it had gone harder, it would be notorious for being like the Dirty Duck movie.
I wouldn't mind an animated version if it went like the Fritz the Cat segue, where
Right.
we have just that nitty gritty. And you're absolutely right. That would be a different following, just like Fritz the Cat was. But I think a lot of the things you attach to, especially with the inconsistencies of Howard, I mean, Howard had 7 different people playing this character. So that's where I think it goes to my original point that there was some inconsistencies of the body language to it, of how we react to it, because everybody's going to have their own interpretation. So, I mean, I think when it comes to our primary, Ed Hale, he did a great job on just the emotional moments, the standing still moments, the facial reactions, or the hand motions. So I think he does a great job with that. And, fun fact, he did play our baby polar bear in Alaska, just throwing it out there. But anyway, so I think this one really did try and do too much. It was very ambitious. And when it comes to the Duck World, I think this is where it really did tease at something bigger. It set high expectations. It's almost reminded me of the cantina scene of Star Wars, where we want to explore this world. We want to see how everybody interacts. We want to see a lot more of this. And it's a beautiful opening scene, and it builds that curiosity. But then, right when we get to the human world, where people can relate to the 80s kind of New York City ish, like scum areas, this is where people just say, I've seen it. I I don't need to see it again. Show me something I haven't seen. George Lucas is notorious for showing me something and experiencing something I haven't seen before. Let's go back to Duckworld. Let's go back to what showed the mere curiosity and the imagination. So it really does start within the first 10 minutes at a high bar. And I think this is where critics really get that level of disappointment where they're like, take me back to this. This is what I want more of. And what we get is more of the same formula. And critics saw a lot of that in the 80s. And this time it's with a duck.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be Cleveland is where they're at, but still. Another thing too, man, like you talked about the score. Let's talk about the soundtrack, the songs, written and composed by Thomas Dolby. She Blinded Me with Science guy, right? He does some great work here. He's also in the movie Rockula, another cult favorite of mine. But yeah, the Howard the Duck song at the end, that's an all-time banger. That's an earworm. And I love the fact that we do have like a little bit of Marty McFly in this duck at the end. He's a guitar player. He does kind of have a little bit of Marty McFly isms to him. And I think that's somewhat intentional because they can play along with the fact that it's Leah Thompson in the main character's role. I think that's a cute little wink and a nod to like other 80s pop culture. I'd say the end of the day, when it comes to discussing this movie critically for me, like on Letterboxd, I gave it 3 stars. And that is just pretty much based on like what kind of film it is to me. But it's more than that in terms of nostalgia and appreciation and just overall entertainment when I watch it. Like I said, it's not like grab off the shelf anytime I want to watch Howard the Duck. I have to be kind of like in the mood for it, or I need to show someone who hasn't seen it. And I think that's where the movie has a big opportunity now that Howard is kind of in the MCU a little bit. You know, they wink and nod to him in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. I think that people now have an interest in older properties to see like, oh, how are they going to work this into the MCU now? Go back and watch Howard the Duck. I'm not going to say it's connected to any Marvel movies, but it does build a world. And I think that's the most impressive part about this movie is the world building. And I think that's something that Lucas and ILM just did really, really well. Now, as for the box office bomb part of it, they talk about it in the conversation, Gene and Roger do. So the thing that I always kind of knew about from watching the Blu-ray special features years ago is that Lucas had just spent all of his Star Wars money perfecting Skywalker Ranch. And he was really riding on this film being a box office success since it was so expensive. He put a lot of his cred on the line with the studio, and the movie ended up being like one of the biggest bombs of all time, especially that year. It hurt Lucas financially so badly that he had to kind of like piecemeal sell a lot of the properties that LucasArts owned. And one of those companies was Pixar. He had Pixar under his belt. John Lasseter and his crew were all working for Lucas, and they ended up selling it to Apple because he essentially lost so much money on this. So if you think of it that way, if Howard the Duck was a raging success, we would have never had the Pixar legacy that we have today, at least the way we know it. It would have been under the Lucas umbrella and probably been something completely different. So if you're a Toy Story fan, if you're a Monsters, Inc. or a Ratatouille fan, thank Howard the Duck for being a failure to have those movies in your catalog.
I love success stories like that you can take crap and make it a flower, because we had the same thing with Peter Jackson with the Frighteners that turned into the 12 computers that turned into the Lord of the Rings. So I love talent and creators that don't stop.
Yeah.
And Lucas, of course, is known for that, Peter Jackson, and a thousand other ones. So these success stories are even more powerful behind the scenes than what we see on screen, and it's absolutely lovely.
All right, so we know how we feel about Howard the Duck. Let's hear what our critics had to say about this. Here we go.
Yes, Howard the Duck came from outer space on a laser beam and landed in our society with a cigar in his mouth and a scowl on his face. And before long, the studio chiefs in Hollywood were scowling too, because Howard laid a real big egg. The movie cost a reported more than $40 million to make, and it grossed just about $10,000 on a million. I don't know if you've ever got that math, but it's not real good. Here's Howard, a little man in a duck suit, visiting the Natural History Museum with his friend, played by Leah Thompson. After the movie was released, everybody said with the benefit of hindsight that it was insane to make a movie about a duck from outer space. But I don't know. I think it would have been possible for Howard to maybe have worked if only they'd started with a funny, likable duck in a comedy. Instead, they made a grim, worried duck in a special effects adventure, and then they filled the soundtrack with bittersweet and even downbeat music to be sure that we didn't get the feeling too good. What a miscalculation.
Okay, let's break this apart a little bit. So first of all, I've never read the Marvel comic books of Howard the Duck, so I have no idea what his personality is supposed to be like. Gene takes a stab at it later on in the conversation, but I like the way Howard is portrayed. If he was a happy-go-lucky duck and this was a happy-go-lucky story, then where are the stakes, right? I think that's the first issue. The second issue is, how dare you, sir, speak poorly about the score? Like you said, that Howard theme, his marching theme, you could say, throughout the movie, I think is so memorable. And the fact that it has different variations, it has the sad variation, it has the happy variation, it has the energetic action scene variation of it. I like that. I like that a lot. And it's also very commonplace with, let's say, a Lucas or a Spielberg production, where your character has to have a theme, a hero theme, whether it's fast, slow, whatever. It matches whatever the energy of the movie is at the time. I think that's fantastic. And the last piece of it is, I really, really think that, yes, this was a miscalculation by the studio and a miscalculation by the filmmakers, but by no means would you be able to say as a critic that it wasn't impressive to look at. Like, it is a good picture. And I've heard these two critics before kind of compliment. They did it with Last Starfighter, where the special effects were more memorable than the movie or the story or the performances. This doesn't get as much credibility. And I think the reason why is because it bombed. If they had reviewed it before it hit the theaters, I wonder what the actual opinion would have been. But the fact that it was already a bomb by the time it hit the show, I feel that's going to take over the conversation more than the actual appreciation or critical criticism of the movie.
I think you're 100% right because reviewing a movie with public opinion, that's you're getting into kind of the bias territory, and that shouldn't even come to a conversation when it comes to critiquing a movie. You're critiquing the movie, not the box office at its quality. And when it comes to Roger saying, or just analyzing Howard, it's kind of almost annoying, but I get it. It's one of these, it's a duck that goes to a different planet. I think if he were to critique it, it should have been, hey, we needed a little bit more emotion. We needed to slow it down a little bit. We needed to kind of see where Howard was going in this new world. Because in fairness, we do kind of rush into Howard meeting the main characters, and we don't get a lot from Howard on this. We just kind of have him thrown in. So that I can understand. But we totally ignore that piece. And, I think you nailed it when you have a score that surrounds characters. And this one does do that, even when we get to the climax where it is almost an Indiana Jones feel, where we have that sense of adventure, where there was some thought and care going into this score, where we feel when that little dune buggy airplane is going through, that score is playing, and we're feeling that excitement all the way to the beginning where we have the song, I think Hungry City is what it's called, where we're feeling that danger element to it. So I think this is where Roger's really missing the holistic pieces of filmmaking that go into it. We can identify, and I think we both agree there's flaws with this movie, but I think Roger is misguided on what his attention's in because what he's relaying to viewers is sounds like what other people had problems with in the beginning and not his own critique that we've heard from other reviews. The uniqueness, the missing emotional input from scenes, because I think that's where he should have focused on, not just kind of generic comments. Because when you go to a score that's obviously memorable, that's a cheap shot where this is a catchy score that goes along with what's happening on screen. He said it's downbeat. In no way is this score downbeat. It's engaging because I can close my eyes and feel the adventure of this score and play the pictures in my head and be excited about it. So I think Roger is really misguided on how he's viewing it, even though I can't say in a critic's eye at this time, it's a good movie, but it's still a misguided review.
Yeah, I feel the score is kind of noirish. It has kind of like that saxophone noir thing. It reminds me actually a lot of the Ennio Morricone score for The Untouchables, which was a year later. This had a jump on it, right? But again, saxophone music, noirish tones of the 80s, that's very common for films of that era. I just don't think he thought it matched this particular property. Anyway, Gene jumps in.
Well, the film is based on a comic book where he's sort of a wisecracking, like, cynical Groucho Marx type duck. If they had done that, that would have worked. Or make it warm a Donald kind of thing, kind of fun. But instead, there is this wandering all over the case where the central character, the duck, the one that we're going to be rooting for, have a rooting interest in, is neither funny or bitter funny. And it doesn't work at all. And as for the special effects, I think that comes out of the success of Ghostbusters, and it is just like thrown on at the end of the picture, at which point they've lost us completely.
Yeah, there he goes with his Ghostbuster comparisons again. He's pretty much just echoing what Roger was saying. I do understand, like, okay, if it was more like a Groucho Marx kind of cigar shaking, wisecracking duck, yeah, that would have been better for the laughs, but I don't think it would be a developable character, right? And the whole point of Howard is like he kind of goes from curmudgeon-y to a savior of the universe, so to speak, right? Like you need to have that kind of character shift for us to be invested in that character. Otherwise, who cares if the wisecracking duck gets killed? I find it really interesting that this is just 2 years prior to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And I feel Roger Rabbit did a lot what this movie is doing. I think he just did it a little bit better in the sense of accessibility for all audiences. Had a lot of mature humor. Jessica Rabbit, big busted cartoon character, right? That's for the adults. But then it also still had the Mickey Mouse, the Donald Duck, the Bugs Bunny for the kids. I'd say if there ever was a movie of the 80s that was really good at getting both audiences in and having them watch it together multiple times, it probably was Roger Rabbit. This could have been that. again, I think the script is where it's a little bit weak. It doesn't know how to tie it all together the way that Roger Rabbit did. But if you think about it, Roger Rabbit is essentially just Chinatown. You know, it kind of already had a blueprint of what it needed to be a noir movie. This one, no, it wasn't. This one's taking its own original approach at what this story is going to be. And I think that even though it's an outlandish idea with an outlandish climax, that's what makes it memorable to me as an appreciator, maybe not just audiences.
I think you're right. The dialogue here, I think, is really simplistic, and I think it's with intent. Could be because we're taking a comic book character, and it's almost like our screenwriter said, we got to take these uh, bubbles from a comic book, insert them into dialogue, make them short and sweet so we can go on to the next scene. So it's very simplistic. It's very a lot of 1 to 2 sentences. Go get them. We got to get out of here. We have to save the world. Watch out, whatever it may be. So it is very simplistic. But I think what we don't give credit to, especially you mentioned Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and even here, is the special effects, even though kind of claymation-ish towards the end. But this is the magic of editing because here it is more prominent on really hiding those flaws, especially when we have our overlord reaching his tentacles out to switches, where the editing has to be on point. I think Michael Chandler and Sidney Wolinski do a fantastic job here when it comes to really engaging us and not just showing us the monster, showing us movements of the monster and getting up close shots of like the tentacle, the movements, and having confidence with that. So, and I think that is the biggest success of what we get to the climax. It doesn't hide away from the flaws. It just gets really, really clever with the filmmaking.
Dude, the diner scene. I think the diner scene is a magnificent piece of filmmaking. The practical effects, the special effects, but then also the performance. You know, again, I'm going to start doing what I do and start calling out movies that were heavily influenced by the movies. Men in Black, man, Vincent D'Onofrio's performance and then how that character ends up at the end is essentially a carbon copy of this, where instead of like the insect, it's the overlord. And to see Jeffrey Jones make that transition from, you know, scientist who's trying to help into a possessed character who eventually becomes the overlord and a giant claymation, you know, character, that is an amazing performance. And it's an amazing character transition. And it's kind of surprising. And it's dark too. The fact that like, oh, this is a guy that was there to help. And now he's the main villain of the movie. I think there's a lot of this film that just gets cherry picked by films in the future, but no one really gives it the credit that it should have in terms of what they did in terms of originality. So with that, let's see what they finished off this conversation with.
Right. Well, the producer of the picture was George Lucas, and he has a company that does special effects, and they did all these special effects. So maybe they did a little more special effects than whether they wanted to make a movie about a duck. Maybe that would have been a good special effect. Just all done right up here.
Again, going back to the special effects, but you know, here's the thing: the special effects are great. I'm sorry, and even beyond the claymation character, the whole wormhole, the whole portal scene, that is fantastic. It is all practical. If this movie was made, let's say in the 90s, it's just cheeky enough to have gotten away with a release, let's say between like 94 and 96, when things like The Mask came out, right? Like when special effect heavy slapstick comedies that were a little on the mature side, that would have been the perfect time for it. But then honestly, anytime after that, I feel like audiences would not have given it credibility. They wouldn't have given it the time of day. It would have been too silly or too violent or too special effects heavy. By the time 2000 rolled around, we were cynical about movies like this, especially critics. So maybe it did come out in the right time, you know? If it wasn't then, it would have had to have been that 2-3 year window in the 90s. And then after that, man, I just don't know. I just think that unless it was bastardized by the MCU, I don't think there's a place in the world for Howard other than when it came out.
You know, I'm going to kind of mimic what I said in the beginning of, you know what, this is my cinematic confession booth. And you know what, I'm going to kind of start ending with, I am so grateful for Howard the Duck.
Yeah.
I am grateful for everything that went into it because, you know, there are so many good things to it. And, you know, watching the 4K version of this, it impressed me that much more because we can watch Ninja Turtles, we can watch Super Mario Brothers, we can watch numerous 4K versions. This one, going into the 4K version, I was expecting a lot of cheese. I was expecting a lot of flaws. And this is one that I didn't see a lot of up until at least the climax, where obviously you're going to see some flaws to it. But the remaster on this is fantastic. And I think it really does deserve a watch if you haven't seen it in 4K, or if you haven't seen it in a while, watch the 4K version because it really did bring me in to a new, different view of Howard the Duck. And you know what? This is one of those in movie history that might not have been appreciated then, but god damn it, appreciate it now because this one is just a lot of fun.
Yeah, and like you just said, the technical prowess behind it is so impressive. I recently watched the original Star Wars trilogy on 4K, and even with the remaster and even with the touch-ups, you see a lot of the matte paintings, you see a lot of the special effects, blue screen imaging transposed through it. You know, it's not perfect, and we didn't care, but you notice it more. This I feel was so flawless in so much of its execution. And where it does seem rudimentary, well, that was just the technology of the day, but they did the best with it that they could. And yeah, so I have a huge appreciation for Howard the Duck, both pop culture wise and technical wise. So, how do I rate Gene's critique of this? So he's not wrong, but if you think about it too, he's not entirely uh, picking the movie apart. Like he's got a negative attitude about it, as many critics did. Of course, he's going to go the same direction like he does with special effect heavy movies, comparing it to Ghostbusters. It's just his thing. But at the same time, like I feel like he could have done a lot worse. I think it deserves a C minus. You know, it's not a terrible review. And again, it is kind of devil's advocate because whoever starts the episode usually has the grounding, right? They're usually the one that's kind of set the tone for the conversation and the critique of the other critic. And if Gene had started with this, he probably would have gone more negative with it. But since Roger already kind of blasted it first, Gene kind of just plays catch up. So I think it's a C minus. I think the movie is better than the critics think and then what audiences thought back then. It needed its cult following, needed its time. But at the same time, like I don't feel that it's an entirely biased review. I feel that he gives credit where credit's due, but is also not afraid to kind of point out the true flaws of the movie.
Yeah, I think I enjoyed Gene's review more than I did Roger's. And I always hate it when we start a review with somebody discussing the box office dollars
I hate
because
it. I
it
hate
really
it.
doesn't fucking matter. Because you're telling people why to go see it, not what other people are thinking or why they didn't buy a ticket. It doesn't matter. And a lot of the key points of what Roger's saying in his review is things that make this movie infamous. It's some of the most memorable pieces of it. But the fact that we forte the wording of duck so many times, we know a goddamn duck's in it. That's the whole premise of the movie. So get over it. The soundtrack's fantastic. The tropes, yes, they're cliche. You see it in any other superhero movie, buddy cop movie, whatever it may be of the 80s. Yeah, you've seen it before. And the fun factor is it's a duck. And we do have flaws with the personality of the duck. I'm not going to hide behind that. But have fun with the filmmaking. Have fun with more than just the special effects. We've talked about it during the show. The music, the editing. There's a lot more than just what looks cool. So this is something that should be addressed, especially with what George Lucas is notorious for, is building worlds, building some characters, building the fun factor. And we have the fun factor here. These two are just the fun police saying, don't go see this movie. You won't have a good time.
Right.
But this is one that it's been proven wrong over time that you can have fun with this movie. But even movies today, you do have the WTF. Why was this made? What the hell is going on? But you know what? They might be critiquing us 20 years down the road too. So, I mean, this is a time that I think audiences weren't ready for, and our critics are showing it here, especially Roger, that he can't say anything better but box office dollars and be negative Nelly on why people will have a good time with this movie.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, what did you give Roger?
Totally missed it because I was pissed off. I'm going to give Roger probably, I'll give him some grace. No, I won't. I'm giving him a solid 1 star.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, this is us kind of like being fanboys of a movie and defending it, so to speak. So, yeah, I think that's totally fair. So, yeah, Howard the Duck. The one thing that I have to just say about the scene, the duck boob scene, I'm totally fine with having duck breasts, but did they have to put nipples on it? Because nipples are like a mammalian thing, right? That's for like milk-fed animals, and ducks don't have nipples, but maybe I just need to like grow up and let it go.
Let loose with your imagination. If Batman can have nipples, so can ducks. It's comic books.
Right. Well, it's also just illicit duck nudity, which honestly I'm here for. Yeah, fine. But give the ducks nipples. It's cool. All right. So next week, we are getting out of this kind of cheesy 80s trope into some haute cuisine cinema. I am bringing to the table David Lynch's Blue Velvet, which is an infamous critique from Siskel and Ebert. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It is one of the reviews that like lives rent-free in my head from the Siskel and Ebert conversation. This one and Lost Highway, which we'll have to cover eventually too. But yeah, I feel like this one and the one you're bringing after it, now we're going into like the darker psychological drama, thriller, kind of kink cinema. David Lynch is so great at that. And it's going to be fun to see what these critics thought of this kind of new wave of filmmaker into the 80s of like making, I guess you could call it dangerous cinema. And that's what Blue Velvet is. So yeah, that's what we're doing next week.
A Lynch conversation is always a good conversation because every other movie, it's a different feeling or opinion, but there's still an appreciation, but this is going to be a good combo.
Yeah, because the only Lynch we've discussed on this episode is during their least favorite episode where Dune was one of their least favorite films of the year. So we had a conversation on that. Now we get to talk about like an actual real critique, not just the little blurb about how much they hated Dune. So that's what we're doing. All right, everyone. Thank you for watching, listening. Please like, rate, review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Follow us on our YouTube channel. Leave a like, leave a review. Please subscribe. And also, feel free to leave a suggestion for a film you'd like us to cover. If it is a movie that Siskel and Ebert covered on their show, and we can find the audio of it online, we will definitely do it. You can find me, Antonio, host of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast, over at thecultworthy.com. You can find my co-host Justin over at
The Movie Wire Podcast at themoviewire.com.
And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.